What's going on, everyone? Welcome to what's today, Thursday, July 4th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. Happy 4th of July to everyone. And we have a nice slate of baseball games today. Smaller slate later, but main slate today, 7 games on DraftKings, 8 games on FanDuel. The FanDuel slate does start at, I believe, 12:35 Eastern. So keep that in mind if you are playing there. I didn't run anything specifically for FanDuel, but that early slate or that main slate starting at 12:35 has the St. Louis and Pittsburgh game. That is a matchup between Andre Payante and Martin Perez. So I think pretty safe to say that you're not going to be interested in pitching there. You can certainly get to bats, although it's not a very good park for hitting. But going to focus on the other 7 games on this one. Catching up on chat, Choke Oldham said, if I subscribe to Endgame, do I have access to all the videos and tutorials that you've already aired? Yeah, if you subscribe to Endgame, everything that we've already done just lives there. You can watch it whenever. I'll talk more about that later on. But yeah, anything we've already done, you have access to, and then obviously anything coming up. So yeah, just going to dive into this one. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. That helps out quite a bit. Like the channel, all that stuff. Comment. If you comment during the show and I happen to see it, I will do my best to answer your questions, whether it's related to the slate or DFS in general. Doesn't matter to me. Starting with the Yankees and the Reds in Yankee Stadium. So starting off with a good park for hitting. Marcus Stroman is going for the Yankees. Frankie Montas going for the Reds. Montas hasn't been particularly good this year. He used to be a good pitcher when he was with Oakland, dealt with some injuries, has not bounced back the way that you would hope to see. Only striking out 18.5% of hitters, 4.57 xFIP. Very, very difficult matchup here against the Yankees. Difficult team to strike out. Tons of power in this lineup as well. So not particularly interested in Montas. He is cheap at 6,500. You can see that I think he's going a little bit under-owned just because of his price, but doesn't look like any sort of a priority here. Stroman, 7,700. Not a great strikeout pitcher. Also just hasn't been as good at limiting production this year as in previous years. Only striking out 17.5% of hitters. Has nearly an 11% walk percentage. He's allowed about 1.1 home runs per 9. 4.68 xFIP. This isn't quite, or at least hasn't been, quite the same Marcus Stroman that we're used to from previous seasons where he doesn't get a lot of strikeouts, but he does limit production, does keep the ball on the ground. He has given up more power this year, and his strikeout percentage is lower than we've come to expect. Not that it's ever great, but it's even worse so far this year. That being said, he does have a pretty good matchup at 7,700. The Reds do have strikeouts in their lineup. They rank third in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year at 26%, only an 89 WRC plus. Stroman projected for between 11 and 12% ownership. Showed up as optimal 13 to 14% of the time for me. It's not that you have a ton of confidence in him as a pitcher. It's just that this is only a 7-game slate, and he is reasonably priced in a pretty good matchup. That being said, I'm not going to be afraid to get to either of these offenses either. The Yankees, I think, goes without saying. You have them in Yankee Stadium. If you can afford them, great. Soto and Judge are obviously great plays, whether it's as part of a stack or individually. And then some of the rest of the lineup does give you a little bit more value as well. We do have a change in the order. Ben Rice is leading off, 2,800 at first base. I haven't built any lineups for cash games, but I would assume that the $2,800 leadoff hitter for the team with the 5+ implied run total in Yankee Stadium is probably a pretty good bet to be your first baseman in cash. He should be really popular today. Right now, projected for about 25% ownership. He showed up as optimal 17% of the time. So clearly a very, very good play, even at the high ownership. Judge and Soto, again, goes without saying. Verdugo's cheap. Torres is cheap. Volpe dropped down in the lineup, but still relatively inexpensive as well. So the Yankees obviously look pretty good here. As I mentioned, Montas hasn't been particularly good this year. 191 expected ISO to lefties is what really stands out. Only striking them out about 16% of the time. Not really a combination that you want in Yankee Stadium. We know how much Yankee Stadium plays up power for left-handed hitters, and now you have a pitcher that isn't doing a good job of limiting quality contact against lefties, and he's not missing bats. You have plenty of left-handed bats in this lineup, so that's going to look really good on an individual level. For the Reds, you do get some negative correlation going up against a 10 to 15% owned Stroman. 167 expected ISO allowed to lefties this year, 172 to righties. Not a ton of power to either side of the plate, but enough that it is interesting in this stadium. Ellie De La Cruz at 6,300 looks very, very good. Projected for about 13% ownership. I think he's actually going a little bit under-owned here. He showed up as optimal like 18 to 19% of the time for me. Spencer Steer at 4,900, Candelario from the left side at 4,300. India's pretty cheap, leading off at 4K. So I showed it before, but the Yankees, not surprising at all that they're showing up as the most often utilized stack. Cincinnati's actually showing up right now for me as the most frequent 5-man stack. That is something that I think, could change by lock, because I think that they look good, but they're not like really separating from the field. But I think it's just a function of De La Cruz looks so good, and then the rest of the lineup is pretty affordable in this park. So getting to them against Stroman does make sense. Obviously, again, the Yankees look really good as well. Houston facing the Blue Jays in Rogers Center in Toronto. For the Blue Jays, we have Chris Bassett. For the Astros, Framber Valdez. Valdez only $7,500 here. His strikeout percentage has come down quite a bit from last season, only striking out 19.3% of hitters, but he does still have a 3.56 xFIP. It's not a good strikeout matchup against the Blue Jays, but again, at this salary, it's just going to make him look like a pretty good play based on his talent level, his ability to limit damage, to keep the ball on the ground. He's projected for about 11% ownership, and I think that's where he should be as well. Bassett on the other side does have a very difficult matchup here. The Astros against right-handed pitching this year have the third lowest strikeout percentage at 18.7%. They have a 111 WRC plus. They have finally started to play good baseball recently as well after a very slow start to the season. I think the big reason that Bassett is getting ownership here and is actually looking a little bit under-owned for me is just, again, that it's a 7-game slate. You don't have a ton of pitching talent on it. Bassett is good, particularly against right-handed hitters. So this does set up, I think, as a very, very good spot for Yordan Alvarez. But overall, when you think about the Astros lineup, obviously Alvarez is left-handed, but Altuve, Bregman, Diaz, Pena, all from the right side. Bassett has a 25.9% strikeout percentage this year against right-handed hitters. He's held them to a 258 expected WOBA, sub 100 expected ISO. Basically, all of the damage that he's given up this year has been against left-handed hitters who have only struck out 17.7% of the time, with about a 200 expected ISO and about a 380 expected WOBA. Yordan Alvarez, again, I think looks like one of the best individual hitters on the slate, which is most slates for him. But even though a matchup against Altuve, Bregman, Pena, Diaz, it's not a good matchup overall. It does set up nicely as far as Bassett just being lights out against righties this year and getting majority of right-handed hitters in this lineup. So again, I think that mostly he's showing up just because of the price and lack of other options on this slate. So I don't mind getting to the Astros for some negative correlation. But when you think about what a lineup you would want a lineup to look like if you're rostering Chris Bassett, obviously you would like the hitters to be worse than the Astros hitters. But from a platoon standpoint, you would want all these right-handed bats that you're going to get from the Astros. So I do understand why Bassett's getting some ownership. But again, the Astros are showing up as a pretty frequent stack for me as well. I expect to be on both sides of this one in tournaments. Toronto showing up further down the list against Valdez. Doesn't give up a ton of power. Like I said, the reason he's as cheap as he is mostly just the lack of strikeouts this season. Still only a 127 expected ISO to righties, sub 100 to lefties. So if you're going to Toronto, I think it's more you're just making the case that like George Springer is really cheap. Danny Jansen is cheap and batting second. There is cheap power in this lineup, but it's a pretty unappealing spot in general against Valdez. So I do think I'll get to the Houston side probably before I get to the Toronto side. The White Sox are in Cleveland taking on the Guardians. As a reminder, this park has been very hitter-friendly this year, particularly for left-handed power. There is now a jet stream that blows out to right field. Ben Lively is going for Cleveland. Jared Schuster pitching for the White Sox. No interest in Schuster here at $7,800, but Lively does look pretty good. $8,200 price tag, getting 20% ownership. Showed up as optimal about 15% of the time for me. I also bet over 4.5 strikeouts earlier this morning at, I believe, plus 105, somewhere in that ballpark. If that's still available and you're interested. 21.3% strikeout percentage, 4.26 xFIP for Lively this year. He has made some improvements from when he was in the major leagues previously before he went to the KBO. And he's got a very, very good matchup here against the White Sox. Chicago ranks 12th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year at 23.2%, but only an 83 WRC plus. Reasonable price tag on Lively. Makes him look pretty good. The Guardians are showing up sixth most in all stack types for me. White Sox are a little bit further down the list. Again, left-handed power in this park does play well. You do have the left-handed starter for Chicago and Schuster, so that's not ideal for the left-handed bats on Cleveland. But if you can get him out of the game early, throw some runs on him, get him out of the game early. Certainly the potential to have the platoon advantage later in the game. Jose Ramirez individually looks very good. 6,400 at third base. Happy to get there if I can. Naylor, if you can afford him, still looks good here. Again, it's pretty unlikely that Schuster goes that deep into this game. On the other side, Luis Robert individually, I think is a good leverage play against Lively in your non-Lively lineups. This is another pitcher that he's fine, and I think he's a good play on this slate. But mostly he's getting 20% ownership just because there's not a ton of great options, and he happens to be facing the White Sox. Those are the types of popular pitchers that I'm most interested in taking some bats against. Luis Robert, we know, is actually good. It's not just a negative correlation play. He is legitimately good. Tommy Pham at 4,400 leading off looks fine. Jimenez at 4K has power. Benintendi's really cheap at 3,100. So I could see getting to the White Sox a little bit just to counter the Lively ownership. But individually, Luis Robert, I think, looks good at that $5,100 salary. One other thing to keep in mind here, and it's not, I guess, super important since his salary has come up so much. Steven Kwan is not, or has not been, the same hitter this year that he has been in the past. He made some adjustments. He's driving balls much, much better than he has previously. He's always been a pretty good hitter as far as he doesn't strike out, he puts the ball in play, and he gets on base. But that's not the most productive DFS hitter. He is hitting for more power this year. So again, 5,600 is a healthy price tag, but he has done stuff to warrant it outside of just being, basically the slap hitter that he was in the past. So that's something to keep in mind if you're kind of biased against Steven Kwan. Next game does have weather concerns as the Tigers take on the Twins in Minnesota. Hopefully we get some sort of clarity on it as we get closer to lock, but it looks like there's a very good chance of storms during the game in this one, and that is problematic. Bailey Ober, 8,700, looks like one of the best pitchers today. He's getting 35% ownership. He showed up as optimal 28% of the time for me. I'm going to hopefully be able to figure out timing of these storms, or some semblance of timing, and that'll impact my decision on Ober. If it's likely that they're getting storms in like the 7th or 8th inning, then I'm going to just roll the dice probably. But if this is storms could pop at any time and it's going to be a lengthy delay, I'll probably downgrade him quite a bit and not get to him as much. The field will probably do the same if that ends up being the consensus forecast. So that is something to keep an eye on. But if weather cooperates here, if weather clears up, whatever, Ober certainly looks very, very good in this spot. Maeda is cheap at 6,300, much more difficult to get to. Tough strikeout matchup, tough matchup overall against Minnesota. But Ober certainly looks good if the weather cooperates. If the weather does not cooperate, then it makes these other plays that we haven't really been excited about even more a part of your day. Like Ben Lively's getting 20% ownership with the assumption that there's nothing that we can just go to Bailey Ober. If you take this 35% ownership away from Ober, you're getting more to Bassett, you're getting more to Lively, you're getting more probably to Valdez, to Stroman. So it will increase the ownership on those other guys, and also as a result make those other contrarian stacks even more appealing. If Lively is going to get 30% ownership instead of 20, the White Sox become that much more interesting. If Bassett's going to get 30% instead of 20 or 15, the Astros become that much more interesting. So that is another side effect potentially if we were to lose this game, or even if we don't lose the game, but the field ends up shying away from Ober because of the weather. So that will be something to keep an eye on. Offensively, pretty tough to want to get to the Tigers against Ober. He is a good pitcher. He does give up some power, if you wanted to negatively correlate, but I would rather be taking bats against some of these other pretty popular pitchers that we've talked about. Righties in particular have a 192 expected ISO against them this year. Lefties are at 154. Riley Green from the left side, 5,100. Just a really good hitter. Perfectly fine one-off in your non-Ober lineups, but overall, I think it'll be pretty tough to get to Detroit. Minnesota looks a little bit better. They certainly have the higher implied run total here. 153 expected ISO allowed to lefties this year from Maeda. He hasn't given up a lot of power in that split, but righties have done a lot of damage against him. 252 actual ISO, 219 expected ISO. Sets up pretty nicely for Carlos Correa. Castro will be from the left side, but he does have MPE leading off. Jeffers at catcher has some power, batting 5th. Miranda's cheap, batting cleanup. So Minnesota does look quite a bit easier to get to. They're going over-owned for me right now, but they are getting ownership. They are an easy team to get to with a pretty high implied run total here against Kenta Maeda. But again, keep an eye on this game. It does seem like once the storms hit, they are probably going to be around for a while. So there is significant weather risk in this one. Next game has no weather risk because it'll be played inside. Boston taking on Miami in Miami. Good park for pitchers. We have Nick Pivetta going for the Red Sox, Kyle Tyler going for Miami. No real interest in Tyler. He is cheap, but it is a tough matchup against the Red Sox. Certainly a lot of interest in Pivetta, though. Strikeout numbers are very, very good. 26.7% K percentage this year, 3.61 xFIP. He does struggle with power, but there's a couple things working in his favor in this spot. One, Miami just downplays power. And two, the Marlins don't have a lot of power. This is one of the weaker offenses in baseball. They rank 14th with a 22.7% K percentage against right-handed pitching this year. Only a 143 ISO on their active roster, 90 WRC plus. There are a couple of hitters in this lineup that are certainly dangerous, but overall sets up as a really good spot for Pivetta. You don't have a lot of good pitching on this slate. Sean V said that Pavetta's a mess right now. Sure, but he was really, really dominant before he was a mess. I have no idea. It's impossible to know when those things are going to change. What we do know is that he has a very good matchup. And if you're going to not play Pivetta because he pitched poorly last time out or the last two times out or whatever it may be, fine. But then you're just playing Bassett against Houston more, or you're playing Ben Lively more. There's no real great answer here, especially if we end up losing Bailey over as well. So I will certainly be happy to get to Pivetta. He doesn't look like he's going that over-owned to me either. 29% ownership, 27% chance of being optimal. I like him a lot in this spot. Offensively, I would expect to be getting to the Red Sox despite the ballpark. They're showing up third most as far as all stacks go. They're showing up fifth most for 5-man stacks. It's just a good offense against an unproven pitcher in Tyler. Pulling up his FanGraphs page now, but not a highly regarded prospect or anything. 27-year-old right-hander, 16% strikeout percentage through his first 3 games in the majors this year. Projects for like a 16% strikeout percentage going forward, around the 4.8 FIP. Sets up as a pretty good spot for the Red Sox. Jarren Duran, very, very expensive leading off, but he does give you stolen base upside in addition to whatever he does offensively. So if you can find the salary for it, great. But it will be tough to prioritize him because of that salary. Tyler O'Neill, a little bit cheaper with a lot of power upside. And he is somebody that can just drive the ball far enough that I'm not as concerned about the park factors in Miami for him, just because of how far he hits it when he connects. It's more of an issue for guys that are generally hitting their home runs like 5 rows deep, and then you put them in Miami. Tyler O'Neill, when he homers, generally hitting it to the moon, so it doesn't really matter as much. Rafael Devers looks great. He's someone that I think looks interesting in tournaments, whether it's in stacks or individually, because we saw it earlier that Jose Ramirez is pulling like 12 to 13% ownership at third base, and Ramirez is obviously a good play, but he was showing up as optimal around 8 to 9% of the time for me. That's the same as Devers, and he's getting half the ownership. So I think that that's a pretty easy way to save some ownership in lineups where you need to. Play Devers as a one-off at third base instead of Ramirez. You're certainly not sacrificing upside by doing that. So I do like that Devers is getting like half the ownership of Ramirez. That's pretty interesting to me. From a negative correlation standpoint, Jazz Chisholm leading off at 4,500, stolen base upside, power upside, negatively correlates with a 30% owned pitcher. He looks fine. Brian De La Cruz is cheap, has some power. Jesus Sanchez, 3,400. The Marlins are really cheap. So you could, negatively correlate with a 30% owned pitcher and then end up with really good one-offs or secondary stacks, whatever, around them. For example, if you stack Miami, you can pretty easily, I think, get to like Aaron Judge plus Juan Soto as a 2-man or something like that. So that is kind of appealing in your larger field tournaments. But, again, a low probability spot. But it is a pitcher in Pivetta that when he is struggling, gives up power. 176 expected ISO to lefties, 225 to righties. When he's not on, the ball gets hit hard and far. So there is certainly merit in your larger field stuff to get into Miami against the popular pitcher. Ben Rice's ceiling is certainly not 7 points, considering a fly ball to right field in that stadium is worth 14. So I definitely am pushing back on what his ceiling is there. Philadelphia taking on the Cubs in Wrigley. Wind not blowing out significantly or anything today. There is rain in this one. It seems right now like it shouldn't be too much of an issue. But again, this is one game to pay attention to. Christopher Sanchez going for Philadelphia. Jameson Taillon for the Cubs. Both of these pitchers are getting some ownership. Sanchez, 20% ownership, 17% chance of being optimal. He looks pretty good here. It's not the best matchup in the world against the Cubs, but it's not horrible either. 12th in strikeout percentage on their active roster against left-handed pitching since last year. 105 WRC plus. And Sanchez has been a solid pitcher. 21% strikeout percentage this year. So not elite strikeout stuff, but he's allowed virtually no power. 0.1 home runs allowed per 9 innings. A 3 flat xFIP this season. It's pretty much impossible to carry that 0.1 home runs per 9 over the course of a season, but his expected power numbers are non-existent along with his actual power numbers. He has allowed a sub 100 expected ISO to both lefties and righties this year. So while I expect it to come up from zero point 0.1 home runs allowed per nine, it might not come up that far. Like, he's been really, really good at getting weak contact. 9K for a 21% K guy isn't generally something that's that exciting. But again, on this slate where you don't have a ton of great pitching, you have legitimate question marks about all of them. Getting to Sanchez is going to just look pretty good. And also, you have plenty of value bats that you can get to. Also, Taillon is showing up just because, again, pitching's pretty weak and he's cheap at 7,300. He's not a very good pitcher. 18.5% strikeout percentage, 4.33 xFIP so far this season. He has been good at limiting power to righties, but he's still not striking them out a lot. Only a 16.7% K percentage to righties, 126 expected ISO allowed. Lefties have done a lot more damage, at least expected damage. They only have a 117 actual ISO against him, but a 192 expected ISO. Sets up nicely for left-handed bats in the Phillies lineup. We don't have that lineup yet, but Bryson Stott looks like a pretty decent second base option at 4,900. Brandon Marsh, if he's batting in the middle of the order at 4K, looks pretty good. But, a little bit weaker lineup than usual, or I guess, a lot weaker lineup than usual when you have a pitcher that struggles with left-handed bats and isn't going to have to contend with the two best left-handed bats on the Phillies. So that does make things look a little bit better for Taillon and obviously worse for the Phillies. But, getting to those left-handed bats is fine. Trey Turner, obviously at 6K, is going to look good against anybody, even though he is right-handed. I think it's tough to get to the Cubs just given how little power Sanchez has given up. If you want to say, they're low owned and they have some talent and it's a 7-game slate, then fine. But you would pretty much need like the first blow up game of the season for Sanchez, which, it can happen. But I think there's some other contrarian spots that I would rather get to before I go up against Sanchez. And then finally, we have the Padres facing the Rangers in Texas. Another good park for home runs to target some offenses, but pretty low total in this one. Two good pitchers on the mound. Michael King for San Diego, Max Scherzer for the Rangers. King getting about 19% ownership. Looks perfectly fine to me. Showed up as optimal about 22% of the time. He has the highest strikeout percentage on the slate at 27.2%, 3.58 xFIP. It is a very difficult matchup. The Padres active roster against right-handed pitching this year has the lowest strikeout percentage. They have the Rangers have the fourth lowest strikeout percentage at 18.8%, 90 WRC plus. So it is an easier matchup than I was thinking when I flipped what team King was on. But the price tag is really nice at 8,400. That's what really makes him stand out here. It's not that it's a great matchup. Like, we know Texas has struggled offensively this year, but they do have talent. I expect that 90 WRC plus to be higher by the end of the season, but it's just a cheap price tag on King. Sean V said fade King. So we're fading Pivetta. We're fading King. I have no idea what pitchers he is confident in playing, but King just looks fine here. Again, there's no pitcher on this slate that you're looking at and saying like, I would be surprised if this guy does poorly. And that's why you're seeing like 20-ish% ownership to so many guys. The only guy actually getting legitimate, like heavy ownership is Bailey Ober, and that may come down because of the weather. So happy to get the King here, even though on a lot of slates he would be like 5 to 10% owned because there would be better pitchers that they just don't exist today. He looks like one of the best pitching options. Scherzer on the other side at 8,800 has a more difficult matchup than King. San Diego's active roster has the lowest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. They have a 122 WRC plus, but it's still Max Scherzer. It's this slate of pitching. He's getting 13 to 14% ownership. Showed up as optimal around 11% of the time for me. So if you land on some Scherzer, fine. He wouldn't be the first guy that I want to go to in this spot, but certainly wouldn't be like Xing him out of a pool or anything either. Offensively, if you're getting to this game, I think it's because of the park and talent level. Seager's the only guy in this game, or Seager and Lowe look like the only guys in this game getting any amount of significant ownership. Seager's fine at 5K. I do think he's going a little bit over-owned here, but it's nice because he negatively correlates with King, so that benefits you in tournaments. Obviously, he's a really good hitter. I mentioned it the other day that it'll be kind of interesting to see how Seager produces in these next few games. He got hit on the wrist in the Baltimore series, avoided an IL stint, but a lot of times you'll get something like this where you look back on it and it's like, oh man, Seager hit like shit for a month, probably because his wrist was hurt. But they're not going to come out and tell you that. So it's really difficult to quantify. There is some risk that Seager's not playing at 100% as a hitter right now, but he is also only 5K. That's a pretty cheap price tag for him. Semien at 4,800 looks pretty good. I really like the price tag on Garcia at 4,500. So getting to some Texas, against a pretty popular king, I think does make sense. I think I would rather, again, I don't know where I'll end up because I haven't built lineups, but at least in my head, I think I'd rather be using Texas as a negative correlation stack than like the Cubs. Yeah, than the Cubs. I think I would rather, like, King gives up more power than Sanchez. I think I'd rather be going to Texas than the Cubs. You get stolen base upside with Wyatt Langford, for example, as well. On the other side, Scherzer has only made a couple of starts this year. I assume he's going to be good going forward, but there is always that rust factor when somebody first comes back from the injured list. And there is a lot of talent on San Diego in a good hitter's park. Cronenworth, Machado, Merrill look like the top guys for San Diego. Not much ownership coming in there, so a decent contrarian stack. I don't think either offense in this game is a priority, but they are both talented enough and in a good enough park that they do make sense in large field tournaments. So to recap, the top pitching on this slate, Bailey Ober is number one, but that comes with a huge asterisk because there are legitimate weather concerns in that game. And if the slate started right now, I either wouldn't be playing this game or I would be significantly lowering my projections for this game. Obviously, I don't have to make that decision for a little bit, but definitely keep an eye on that. It looks like there could be like game-ending storms at some point during this game. Pivetta looks like the best pitcher in a non-weather situation. Good matchup, good park, volatile pitcher, but I'll take volatility on a slate like this. At least he gives me legitimate strikeout upside. Michael King looks pretty good because of his price tag. Bassett's matchup scares the shit out of me, but he does get a lot of righties, which is nice for him. They're good righties, which sucks, but he looks fine. Christopher Sanchez looks fine. Ben Lively in a good spot. You can kind of just see here that outside of Bailey Ober, none of these pitchers inspire a lot of confidence, and Ober has weather issues. So I expect this to be a slate where like I am getting to these popular pitchers because I do think they are the best options on the slate. But the combination of not very good pitchers getting ownership and only a 7-game slate makes me think this is also going to be a slate where like my highest owned stacks are pretty frequently going against popular pitchers to get that negative correlation in large field tournaments. As far as top stacks, Yankees showing up a lot, Red Sox showing up a lot. I like both of those. Cincinnati, happy to get to them against Stroman, who's getting some ownership in Yankee Stadium. Ellie De La Cruz, in particular, I thought was going a little bit under-owned. Houston against Bassett makes sense just from an upside standpoint. And then you get a bunch of stacks that kind of just look very similar. I will add in the White Sox and Miami as negatively correlated contrarian stacks. Miami, in particular, very, very cheap as well, so you can get some good one-offs with them. That's all I have for you today. Thank you for checking out the show. Don't forget to give it a like. If you have not already signed up for Endgame Syndicate, that link is in the description below. It was mentioned at the top of the show, but you have access to all the videos we've already recorded. That's Brick75, Utical, Nerdy Tenor, and myself talking intermediate and higher level DFS strategy with the goal of teaching you how to essentially be self-proficient and make money on your own without relying on 100 different content sites. So check that out if you haven't already, and have a good rest of your 4th of July. Thanks for checking out the show.